So again, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the February 1st Friday here at the School of Public Affairs. We are delighted to have you in person and both online. We have a lot of people online as we live stream this and also tape it. I'm Paul Teske. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs here at CU Denver, and we're celebrating our 50th anniversary, both CU Denver as a campus and the School of Public Affairs in Denver. And so, as some of you know, our First Friday series this year has been focused on 50 years of topic X. And in the fall, we looked at population growth, politics, criminal justice, and nonprofits. And in the spring, we are today looking at public finance. And in March, social equity issues, and in April, environment and water. So we're trying to hit the big topics, and we frame them as 50 years. I mean, obviously, most of us have not had 50 years of experience in Colorado with these issues, but we're taking the big view and also looking back, but looking forward. And we have a terrific panel here today to do that. So thank you for joining us. A couple of logistics: bathrooms are around the corner. Please continue to grab some breakfast, and please help me thank David of Scratch Catering, who prepared today's breakfast. David runs a minority-owned small business, and we try to do that for our catering to celebrate that in Colorado. A couple of other comments, I'll keep them short. We, in public finance at the School of Public Affairs, we are a highly ranked school by US News in the top 15 in the public finance world, and a couple of our faculty are here today, I think, grabbing some breakfast, Christine Martell and Todd Ely. We also have Jeff Profiter. And so they're the folks that make us highly ranked in public finance and help us turn out alums who thrive in this world. And we have two of them here today on our panel, which is awesome as well. Christine wanted me to let you know that there's a big event February 22nd in Boulder, sponsored by the school, the business school at Boulder as well, and Women in Public Finance on bond financing rules and techniques and ways to do that in Colorado. And so there's a flyer for that, I think, that we're making available. And if you are deeply interested in public finance, please pursue that, or please talk to Christine about how best to do that. I also want to thank the staff of the School of Public Affairs who checked you in and helped organize all of this. Joan Fishburne, Tula Wellbrook, Dee Dee Flynn, Lisa Van Ramdonk, and others that have been helping us with these events. So please join me in thanking them for organizing all of this. We finished with the panel at 10, but we don't get kicked out. So if some of the panelists can stay, or you just want to chat and network with each other, please feel free to do that for a while. And also, the panelists will be talking with each other for part of this time, but there will be time for questions. And I think there were 3x5 cards that you can fill in with questions, and we'll come and pick those up around 9:30, 9:40, so that we can address some of those to the panel when the time is right. So hopefully I've covered most of the logistics, and we can get started with the actual issues in the panel. And so we have a terrific panel here. You've seen some of their bios up on the screen, and we have a great moderator. And our moderator today is from Kutak Rock, Fred Marienthal, a partner with that law firm who focuses on public finance. Kutak Rock is sponsoring today's event, the breakfast, and the other activities associated with this. So please, a big hand for Kutak Rock and their sponsorship of our First Friday. Fred himself is an amazing alum of the school. His undergrad is from University of Arizona. He, of course, has a law degree working for a law firm from University of Denver, but he has an MPA from the School of Public Affairs. He worked with Tim Wirth back in the day, and we have the Wirth Chair, of course, in the school. And so Fred's been a great alum associated with that. He's also on the CU Board of Trustees. He's on the School of Public Affairs Advisory Board, and just very involved with the community. He's involved with lots of K-12 school activity in Boulder and other things around the state. Kutak Rock and Fred in particular finance and help finance a lot of higher ed activities that go on around the state and indeed around the country. So please join me in welcoming Fred Marienthal.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Since I'm here in CU, do I now refer to you as Dean Prime? Is that how you want to? No? Okay, you'll take it. Okay. Thank you, Paul, for the very, very kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. Before I introduce the panel, I thought I'd offer up a few words on public finance and TABOR. Caveat, my law firm insists I say this. My observations are my personal views and do not express the views of my law firm and should not be construed as legal advice. That last part should not be construed as legal advice. Many of my clients, that's their operating assumption sometimes. My involvement in public finance has been in the world of debt. So you could call me a merchant of debt. If a client comes to me and says, hey, I have a project, it's 100% grant funded. I said, I'm not really excited about your project. There's no debt. That's all I know how to do. And so in my 40 years working as a bond lawyer, I've participated in many transformative projects, not only here in Colorado, in many states in the United States here. For example, in the 1990s, this very building, as well as the building at 14th and Larimer, were financed with tax-exempt bonds. We acquired the buildings utilizing tax-exempt bonds. And you can just look out the window and see some very remarkable tax-exempt bond finance projects. So Mile High Stadium, Coors Field, DIA, E470, the Northwest Parkway, many of the RTD projects. And most recently, the one I'm very proud of is the CSU Spur facility down at the National Western Center. All three buildings are now open, representing an investment by the state and CSU of $250 million. And if you haven't been down there, try it out. It's really cool. Tax-exempt bonds have financed across the state higher education facilities, healthcare facilities, K through 12 schools, affordable housing, which is very crucial today, open space. I live in Boulder, and the open space program there, as well as in Jefferson County, is preserves some of the only green we have left out that way, for better or for worse. Museums and cultural facilities. And much of our just fundamental infrastructure that we take for granted. So your roads, your streets, sidewalks. And for an area, I've practiced for 40 years in public finance, and I occasionally will meet people and they ask what I do in the law, and I'll explain to them, and they say, what is that? And I'll say, well, you're standing right in front of a building that was just financed with tax-exempt bonds. It's all around us. And that's why I find it very, very exciting. In 1992, I joined our law firm in 1983 after 3 years working for Congressman Tim Wirth here in the Colorado District Office. In 1992, so I was a relatively young lawyer at that time, TABOR was adopted and approved by the voters, and it limits the amount of revenue the state of Colorado and its districts can retain and spend. What I'm going to do just for a few seconds here, or a few minutes, is just level the field as to make sure everyone has the same understanding as to what TABOR is. Specifically, TABOR allows the state to retain and spend an amount based on the prior fiscal year's actual revenue or limit, whichever was lower, grown by Colorado inflation and population growth, and adjusted for any voter-approved revenue changes. This is all in our Constitution. Referendum C, a voter-approved revenue change passed in 2005, allowed the state to retain and spend all revenues collected between FY fiscal year 2005 and 2009, and then 2010 and thereafter. Referendum C allows the state to retain and spend all revenue collected to the referendum C cap, grown by inflation plus population growth, from the FY revenue level, provided that the revenue retained in excess of the pre-2005 TABOR limit base be spent for certain programs. This is all in our Constitution. Constitutions are supposed to be relatively readable, understandable documents. Here in Colorado, for better, mostly for worse, in my opinion, we have chucked it full with all sorts of these types of provisions. The TABOR amendment requires voter approval for tax increases and tax policy changes. Fees can be increased by the state legislature without voter approval. Fees. big jurisprudence areas to what a fee is and what produces fees. The magic language in TABOR is enterprises. If you're an enterprise receiving less than 10% of governmental support, and you're doing a business that the private sector generally would provide, you're going to be outside of TABOR. Up until the last election, who remembers Proposition 117? Proposition 117 constrains the creation of new enterprises driven by fees. So there's a populist group here in our state who are very concerned about what they and their constituent entities and people want to spend to support government, and therefore limit perhaps the growth of government and the activities of government. Colorado's public services have suffered under TABOR. We'll get into this some more due to TABOR's forced deep spending cuts. Colorado's national rankings on a number of critical public services plummeted in the years after it was adopted in 1992. For example, Colorado fell from 35th to 49th in the nation in K through 12 spending as a percentage of personal income from 1992 and 2001. Colorado's college and university funding as a share of personal income declined from 35th in the nation to 48th by 2008, and we're still a basement dweller today. Colorado fell to the bottom of national rankings in providing children with full vaccination. It even suspended its vaccination programs between 2001 and 2002 because it couldn't afford to buy vaccines. Fast forward today, that would have been a real bad situation to be in. The share of low-income children in the state without health insurance doubled between 92 and 2005, while falling in the rest of the nation. So there's been very, very serious consequences as a result of the adoption of TABOR. The business climate and economy deteriorated under TABOR initially. The measure contributed to a credit downgrade by the rating agencies. In 2002, and alarmed business leaders by undermining the state's ability to invest in its basic infrastructure and workforce. Everyone loves a paradox. Big paradox here, notwithstanding TABOR, the population has grown, jobs are being created, the state and its local governments have strong credit ratings, and our economy has been strong. We'll discuss a little bit of that this morning as well. It's kind of a fun mind and imagination exercise to think about how our state might look if TABOR had not been passed. If you're so inclined, as our lightning round question at the end on your card, answer the following question. If TABOR had not been passed, Colorado would be fill in the blank. So if TABOR had not been passed, Colorado would be fill in the blank. And if you, like I said, are so inclined, put a little blank on your card and fill that in. I'd be interested to see what folks have to say. On to the panel to do our introductions. Terri Velasquez is the finance director for the city of Aurora. She is responsible for operations of the city's finance department and the overall management of the city's finances. Previously, Terri worked for the city of Colorado Springs in a number of capacity, including director of finance and administrative service and chief financial officer. Terri received her master's degree in finance and bachelor's degree in accounting from the University of Colorado, and is licensed as a CPA, a certified public accountant in the state of Colorado. She holds a certified public finance officer designation from the Government Finance Officers Association, and very pleased to have her here this morning. She is currently the president of the Government Finance Officers Association, or as we call it, the GFOA. Thank you, Terri, for being here this morning.
Thank you.
You bet. Let's see, Kate. Kate Watkins is the president and chief economist for Bright Fox Analytics and an economic and data analysis consulting firm dedicated to helping businesses businesses and governments navigate the evolving economic and policy landscape. Prior to founding Bright Fox, Kate served as the chief economist for Colorado's Legislative Council staff, as an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and as an economic consultant in the private sector. Kate holds a PhD from Cornell University with research concentrations in economic and fiscal sociology and a master's degree in global finance, trade and economic integration from the University of Denver. Kate is a long-standing member and the current vice president of the Denver Association of Business Economists. Thanks again, Kate, for being here, or Dr. Kate, thank you. And then finally, my colleague and friend, Steve Clark. Steve has been in this business longer than I have, 45 years, involved in public finance. And he's of counsel currently with a firm he founded called SB Clark Companies, a boutique public finance consulting firm that works nationally, specializing in tax credit, leveraged, and tax-exempt bond finance for housing and economic development in low-income areas. Steve was in the professional practice of public finance for over 45 years, serving a variety of public entity and nonprofit clients. Prior to forming SB Clark Companies in 2001, Steve was managing director with Piper Jaffray & Co., known as Piper Sandler, for 11 years, and with Betcher & Company, a Denver-based regional investment banking firm, for 13 years. Steve is very active in the community, including serving on the Downtown Denver Partnership since 1989, on the boards of the Colorado Trust, Denver Health Foundation, and the Senior Housing Options, Inc. He is currently serving his second elected four-year term as director and treasurer of Midtown and Clear Creek Metropolitan District. So round of applause for our panel, please. You know, I'm going to work with from my right, left. We'll just start serving up some questions, one question, and then we'll come back around. How's that sound? Okay, great. Terry, we'll start with you. How has the city of Aurora used tax-exempt debt to finance its capital projects?
Well, primarily the city of Aurora utilizes tax-exempt debt for things like fire stations, police stations, recreation facilities. But more recently, we use tax-exempt debt to provide roadway maintenance, a catch-up on roadway maintenance. And in that particular instance, we did use COPs, but we couldn't use the streets as collateral. That's always the big challenge with COPs, is what is your collateral? And so the tax-exempt aspect of it's great, right? We get low cost financing for our organization. But we're kind of coming to a place now at the city of Aurora where we're running out of assets to pledge. And we have a backlog of capital needs that are near $1 billion. So as we're looking into the future, we really do need to consider pursuing general obligation debt financing, which is kind of a rarity these days in Colorado, unless you've gone to the voters and had that approval. And we're fortunate to have Laura Perry, who worked on the city and county of Denver's initiative for a lot of their debt issues and backlog in items for capital. But I would say, you know, it is a wonderful thing to have tax exempt financing available to you. And as long as you have the revenues and the means, I think it's pretty straightforward. And for those that don't know about COPs, they're certificates of participation, and those are just basically like a lease. So you don't necessarily have to go to the voters for approval. And that is probably one of the challenges that TABOR has placed on local governments, is this need to go to the voters to be able to issue debt, even if you have the revenues to fund the debt and to pay for it. So.
Well, thanks. COPS, COPS, certificates of participation. Raise your hand if we use an acronym and you want a translation, because
there'll be plenty of them.
There'll be plenty of acronyms. There'll be plenty of acronyms.
There you go.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Steve, from your vantage point, what have the impacts of TABOR been on municipal finance?
Well, as Terry talked about, tax exempt borrowing is the primary source of capital funding for state and local governments. And in Colorado, the state government could never issue bonds directly. It is, but constitutionally had to have a balanced budget each year. But they used alternative financings in the early 80s, actually did one of the very first COPs for a project funding that the Kutak firm worked on. I would say, excuse me, having been in public finance since 1977, I saw in 1992 a significant amount of change as a result of TABOR coming on. Initially, the investors were nervous. They wanted to know what happened. As Fred said, the rating of the state was downgraded as a result. The business community was upset. Just a small example, the cities and towns of Colorado under, I believe the Constitution, but it might have been statutory, were allowed to issue general obligation bonds for water, for their water systems, because water was so important in Colorado. Well, that got wiped out with TABOR because it then had to be voted. All debt had to be voted unless it was an enterprise. And Fred talked about how you got to be an enterprise. So Denver Water, for example, which showed general obligation bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the city and county of Denver and the ad valorem taxes, unlimited ad valorem taxes. They could be raised to any amount in order to make sure that debt is repaid. TABOR upset that. So the water board then entered into issuing revenue bonds. And part of Fred's paradox, what's happened? Well, Denver Water has a AAA rating. It's one of the very few, the city of Denver and the Denver Water Board, AAA rated entities in the state of Colorado. But they've done that because of the fabulous growth of Colorado, even though they weren't able to pledge the city's full credit for that water system. It's just one of the examples. It costs them, I don't know how many untold millions of dollars on their hundreds of millions of dollars of debt issued over the past 30 years as a result of not being able to use the GEO bond. GEO bond questions themselves became much more complicated. School districts, you had to put the total amount of principal and interest that would be required to repay the debt. And it was a way of suppressing the idea of passing bonds because it was right there in the question to scare people. You know, usually say we're going to borrow $10 million. And that was a lot of money in 1992 for a school district in Steamboat Springs. But if you put $22 million for principal and interest over a 25-year schedule, and then we're going to pass it, maybe we have 3 projects over 3 years, so we'll sell bonds 3 times. You have interest rate risk and you get all this tied up in the bond question, which really fouled things up in terms of being able to communicate clearly with the voters. We've talked about the COPs and the annual renewal or the annual appropriation financing. Key thing about the leases is that the reason it gets around the voted debt requirement is that it has to be annually budgeted, the rent payment, the lease payment. Well, the investors go, well, how do I know city council next year or 10 years out is going to annually appropriate that debt, that rent payment to repay what is essentially a debt, even though it's called a certificate of participation in a lease? Well, that raised the borrowing cost for many projects. We used to call it the Taj Mahal for Jefferson County. It was one of the first early ones built with hundreds of million, 110 or $115 million of COPs for that. What's now, you know, beautiful, very necessary facility. But at the time, there was lots of grousing by this populous part of Colorado that says, you know, you should have put that on the ballot, voted it. Likely would never have passed. So institutional investors have now come to understand Colorado and its tax and expenditure limitation. It's really complex. We'll talk about that more later, but it's cost us money. At the same time, you know, the citizens in the state, everybody's learned to live with it, made the amendments like referendum C. So I've gone way long here.
Nope, that's a great answer. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Touched on a lot of the day-to-day and also more on the paradox. City and County of Denver has a AAA rating. City of Boulder has a AAA rating. What's your rating?
Moody's gave us a AAA. So
Yeah.
City of Aurora,
City of Aurora.
as well as our water utility, which I forgot to mention, a water and sewer utility has a AAA rating from Fitch.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're doing very well.
And it's based, I think the primary job for that is the primary reason for that. There was a coincidence of 1992 and in migration. I really enjoyed one of the first 50 first Friday breakfasts. We had the state demographer here a few months ago and talking about the trajectory of our growth from 1970s 2.5 million to cresting 6 now, right? On our way to 7 in the next 50 years, 7.5, I think is what she said in the next 50 years. More or less based on what you see out the window, beautiful mountains and the business environment. And a lot of Californians worrying about where their next cup of water is coming from. Right. They wanted to come upstream. Kate, how has state tax policy evolved over time? And how has this evolution impacted inequity across demographics in the state?
Great. First and foremost, thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful, esteemed panel, and I'm so excited to be on it. And thank you all for being here today. So I think it's a really important question, the evolution of tax policy and its implications for inequality across the state. I think that there are a lot of different ways to look at inequality, to analyze inequality, and I'll focus my time just on individual income tax, in that it's the largest source of revenue to the state of Colorado. Looking over the last 50 years, there really hasn't been a tremendous amount of change in the tax rate. Back in the 70s and the 80s, we had a graduated tax rate. The highest rate was 8% relative to our 4.5 now, but 8% graduated rates, the highest rate, 8% for those making basically any income over 10 grand. So that was the graduated rate or the highest graduated rate for a number of years. We shifted to a flat income tax, and it's largely stayed the same, around 5%, now 4.5. So ticked down a little bit over time, but really largely unchanged. So when you're thinking about a flat tax, that certainly has implications across income groups, and those income groups have some other implications when it comes to demographics. So we can glean some insight just off of that flat tax, what that means for high income versus low income earners. I think where the evolution has really taken place is around tax expenditures, and specifically tax credits. And it's really been an evolution that's only happened recently, where we've had an expansion of the earned income tax credit, an expansion of the child tax credit, or a creation of the child tax credit here in Colorado that piggybacks off of the federal tax credits for both the EITC and the CTC. That's been really a recent evolution. And I think more and more of an emphasis has been on creating tax breaks for lower income individuals. There's also been a bit of an evolution in tax credits for businesses. That's been kind of a pullback on some of those incentives. So if you're a business planning on relocating to Colorado, some of those kind of come on in, we'll give you a nice tax credit. Some of those have been scaled back a bit over time, and that's been, again, a more recent evolution. One other thing that I think is interesting to look at is the TABOR refund mechanisms. So we've talked a lot about TABOR. TABOR, we've got a limit, a cap on how much revenue the state can retain and spend. Anything above that cap gets refunded back to taxpayers. And back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, the economy was booming in Colorado, huge TABOR refunds being given out, and a lot of those TABOR refunds went to businesses and kind of specific carve outs for certain types of companies and or capital gains deductions that tend to go towards higher income earners. Over time, we've seen an evolution in those TABOR refund mechanisms where they've now been more kind of redistributing some of those that income to lower income earners. So I think an interesting evolution there as well. So again, it's, I think, a very important question, and one that I've only kind of brushed the surface, only talking about the income tax rate, but one that's been interesting in and of itself.
Yeah. Kate, you mentioned several times tax credits, and tax credits play a big part of public finance today. In particular, Steve and his daughter's firm do a lot of work with new market tax credits, low-income housing tax credits. The new market tax credits stimulate economic development and revitalization. Low-income housing tax credits assist in a capital stack for affordable housing. In the last Congress, when they passed the inflation bill, they did something with respect to some tax credit programs that we haven't seen roll out yet because Treasury, Department of Treasury, the IRS, is still working on the regulations. And that is for certain tax credit programs, if you're a state or local government, a nonprofit, a tribal nation, you can take the credit directly as opposed to taking it through a third party investing equity in your project. So for example, if you're financing a broadband system in rural areas that have a certain low level of service and you're going to bring them up to a certain level of higher level service, that local government can do two things. They can either take a tax credit directly, or there's a new flavor of private activity bonds that they can issue to finance that type of facility. Same with carbon capture facilities, and then greenhouse gas reduction and different renewable projects as well. So solar, geothermal. And again, we haven't seen those dollars come into projects yet because the Treasury is still working out on how to implement them. We also don't know if the current Congress might undo them. But it could be real exciting in terms of seeing some projects that were hungry for capital and now can get the capital directly. We're going to come back around. Terri, how has TABOR impacted the city of Aurora's finances?
That's really a great question. You know, the city of Aurora was really fortunate to have taken measures fairly early to de-TABOR. I like to call it that. And what they did is in the year 2000, they asked the voters if they could basically exempt the sales and use tax from TABOR and our fees. So we were able to do that, but there was a trade-off. And in doing so, we gave up 3 of our property tax mills. And so, you know, asking staff and thinking a little bit about this myself, you know, we think about, you know, what did we gain? A lot. And we're really happy that we don't have to go back to the voters every year and ask for excess, you know, over the cap revenues to retain those or anything like that, which I did a lot of that when I was at the city of Colorado Springs. And in fact, in Colorado Springs, we had TABOR in place before it was a statewide law. So at the city of Aurora, when I think about what we did to de-TABOR, I'm really proud, but there is a big cost to that. And when I think about it, and I really measure that 3 mills over the last 23 years in today's dollars, that's almost $500 million. It's big money. And when you think about our capital infrastructure backlog being close to $1 billion, wouldn't that have paid for a good portion of that? Now, you know, some people might think that that's not how it would have been allocated, or who knows. But I like to think that, you know, we would have had more money available for capital projects than we do today. Our capital projects are very, very limited to grants, grant match, you know, COPs where we can squeeze it out. So it's had a significant impact financially. And then more recently, we've started to reach the cap for our property tax. That was the only piece that was not de-TABORed, was our property tax. And so when we're over the limit, what we do is annually we adjust that mill levy down to try to stay under the cap. So that's costing us another 3, 4, maybe even $5 million a year that we can't utilize. And so we haven't gone back to the voters to ask about de-TABORing the property tax at this point. So that would be a council decision, but it's certainly something that I would like to see into the future.
Great, great. Steve, and Kate, feel free to jump in on this one too. Has TABOR led to accelerated or restrained economic growth here in Colorado?
Well, I really think Kate could probably knock this one out of the park, so I'll say just a few little things and then hand it right to you if you care to. But right after TABOR was adopted, a number of other states around the country tried to look at these TELS, tax and expenditure limits, have been considered by multiple states across the country. And they kept pointing at Colorado and said, well, look at the growth that's occurred as a result of TABOR. Well, an exhaustive study was done in 2005 that tried to control for the normal economic and mostly demographic trends that had been there and did a comparison with surrounding states. And it proved conclusively that in fact it was constraining far more than it was and beneficial to the state of Colorado. And I guess the last comment I'll make about this, and then we go on to Kate, is that TABOR is kind of a meat axe. It sets the growth limits on a population growth for the state plus inflation as measured by the urban price, consumer price index. That doesn't have anything to do with rural countries, doesn't have anything to do with healthcare versus education versus what state services are. So the limitations of taxes and revenues are constrained by a very broad measure that makes it much more difficult to manage. Governing should be done at the lowest level possible because that's where the needs can be identified. The councils, the legislatures, the county commissioners should be making budget allocations where needs are greatest. Anyway.
I think very well put. And I think to riff a little bit off of what you've said, the population plus inflation growth limit is just that, population plus inflation, or population growth plus inflation. That's not always a great indicator of economic activity. Economic activity tends to grow faster certainly during expansions than population plus inflation growth, and then tank during a recession. But over time, the economy has outpaced population plus inflation growth. So in thinking that through, your state government, to the extent that it's only growing, or state and local governments to the extent that they're only growing by population plus inflation growth, they're not keeping up with total economic growth. Some might think that that's good, some might think that that's bad. It's sort of, to what extent is government crowding out private sector development growth? And then also, to what extent does the lack of state and local government services constrain private sector growth? So things like roads, infrastructure, getting to the job, having commerce, having infrastructure that allows commerce to exist, educating your workforce. Those are really the trade-offs. Because I grew up as a nonpartisan economist serving both sides of the aisle, I'm very careful about being critical of TABOR, and so you might see me being a little bit of an economist on one hand, and then on the other hand, but I think that those are the trade-offs that we faced with TABOR, and to some extent, it really has limited government. To other extents, government has still grown, but it's maybe grown in a way that wasn't as flexible, wasn't as that couldn't adapt as quickly as it would have otherwise, because of the many different ways that TABOR affects government, the way that the government taxes and spends and takes on debt and spends.
Okay, great, thanks for that. Follow-up question, because you mentioned recession. I'm not going to ask you if we're going to have one, because I promised you I wouldn't do that. We could do a show of hands. How many think we're heading into a recession? Okay. Sure.
Yeah, sorry, excited to really, TABOR was put in place.
Okay. The person asking this question is Terri Rodriguez, parentheses, candidate for mayor, close parentheses.
Recovering investment banker, like Steve.
No, I'm retired.
Are you recovered though?
You're what, a banker for 23 years?
23 years.
Yeah, 23.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks. Gracious of you to.
Yeah. You
introduce
started when you were about 10?
Yeah. I figured out how to get younger over time.
my question is, Tabor is a remnant set in stone from 1992. And there are fundamental facets of our economy that have evolved since then in dramatic ways. And maybe one of the latest ones is this idea that the employment market is far more global and national than it was, pre-pandemic with work from home and, remote work and everything else. So as our economy has evolved, yet we're stuck with this remnant from 1992. Do you see this? Do you have a sense of, is this gap between what Tabor does provide for and what it should provide versus what it should provide for? Is that growing, narrowing? I mean, how do you see that playing out, crystal ball wise?
It's tough question, and I would love to kick it to the other panelists as well. I mean, in looking at the history of Tabor, I think we also have to look at the history of legislation that has also been introduced. I mean, and even things like referendum C that have really changed what Tabor looks like and what its implications are. So for example, with referendum C, Tabor in its originally conceived, anytime you have a downturn in the economy and tax revenue comes down, you have this ratchet down effect. And so you're constantly ratcheting down revenue. And so you're really not even keeping up with population plus inflation growth. Ref C kind of fixed that and enabled continuous growth over time. So I think it's harder to, I mean, really Tabor has evolved over time, I think because of that, or because there have been all of these different changes. And I think that's allowed state and local government to evolve as well as the economy has evolved. So I'll kind of leave it there and then kick it to the other panelists.
Yeah, I see it as quite simply as pain point. Okay, so as the economy evolves and over time creates different pain points that folks living here in the state can't tolerate anymore or haven't built a callus over, then we'll see a referendum C, or we'll see, I love your phrase, detaboring, in areas where it hasn't been detabored. Or if the pain is significant and due to dislocations in the economy, for example, what's the impact of commercial properties all of a sudden not having the same value and huge gaps and holes in your top 10 property taxpayers? Right. And you can't provide fundamental services. What's the pain point that the state would have to cross where a ballot initiative to untabor the Constitution? So I see it as a matter, quite frankly, is that's the reaction, more grassroots politics, saying this is no good anymore. And it creates that polarization, however, but there will be common denominators, maybe bring people to the table that, hey, we've got to do something about the homeless. We have to do something about healthcare being affordable and in facilities that are adequate. And we need tax dollars to do that. How do we get that? That's kind of how I see it. Steve or?
I'd just add from the local government perspective that, we've seen since Tabor was put in place, a lot of success in detaboring because of the things you're talking about, the need really driving the detaboring aspect. So, on a positive side, I would say that people have moved further away from Tabor and that gap has shrunk as a result, because I do think our communities realize that they get what they pay for, that if you don't invest in your communities, you're going to have consequences for that. I'll use Colorado Springs as one of the examples where they've actually invested more in their roadways and roadway maintenance now, and it had tax increases, although I think they have some sunsets included. Those have passed. So historically, you would think, it's such a conservative community that, you don't necessarily see them detaboring, but they've done quite a bit
Yeah.
really, over the years.
Yeah, I think a good example, again, a kind of the pain point example is down in Colorado Springs after the
Mhm.
fire, the big fire.
Oh,
There
yes.
was 300, 400 houses lost. And the next election cycle, they put on the ballot a public safety tax
Mhm.
to make fire protection and police and fire give them more money, and it passed in all places, Colorado Springs.
Right.
And I would have lost a significant amount of money if I were one to wage on a ballot initiative, but because I didn't see that one coming necessarily. Steve, any thoughts on this one?
Well, I was thinking about both higher education and public education. Amendment 23 was a significant reaction to
Mhm.
TABOR, which was passed in the early 2000s, which said, we're not, the state's not funding K-12 education properly. And not only inflation, but inflation plus 1% for the next 10 years is going to go to public education. And then, of course, we get to a recession of 2008, 9, 10, and we created a negative factor. Well, we owe public education. This is what the state Joint Budget Committee, which is really the governor for economic purposes in the state of Colorado, in my opinion. So this complexity and this rendering of problems and then creating overlapping responses to it is really inefficient and ineffective. And I think it's constrained. I mean, Colorado has only grown as well as it is because we've imported our higher education persons. We haven't invested in our higher education to the extent if we were in the Rust Belt, we'd be dead. I mean, we would not have the tools to make this. We've been bringing people in with lots of education and employing them in the high-tech industries and all the other activities in Colorado.
Okay.
Kind of in spite of people.
Great.
Yeah.
No, thanks. We're going to do one more round of questions with us, and then we'll do two things. Share the answers to the lightning rod after I ask these folks to do their lightning rod. And thank you very much for participating. Hopefully we'll get to these. Terri, one more question. I'm going to ask you, because I would be remiss with your current reign as president of the GFOA if I didn't ask you what's new and exciting in debt management initiatives GFOA is working on right now.
Actually, there's probably a really long list, but I'll consolidate it. So every year we meet in Washington, D.C., our GFOA has what's called standing committees. And we have standing committees that allows a lot of finance folks from across the country to come together and establish what's called best practices. So if you look on the GFOA website, you can find those best practices. And with those best practices, in particular with the debt area, right now they're focusing in on the ESG aspect of debt, the environmental, social, and governance. So they're looking at updating some best practices around that. They're also looking at updating best practices that will help assist with low-income affordable housing, which is another area. Trying to remember the other one, the last one that they're going through. I think it's on the taxable debt in private placement, and trying to update previous best practices to bring them more current. And then the last thing is more disclosure, because we want that dialogue or flow of information between the issuers and the investors. So those are just some of the things that GFOA is working on the debt committee.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you for doing that work. It's terrific.
Thank you.
When you're meeting in Washington, D.C. and other far-flung places with the GFOA, and you tell them you're from Colorado and work for the Springs, work for Aurora, did people recognize the constraints of TABOR or ask you about TABOR?
They do. And in fact, we've had several conversations, but as I've been president and you go across the country, you find out about their challenges as well. But no other state, in the US has TABOR. They have other versions of what might look similar to TABOR, but yes, it is recognized as a very large constraint.
Great. Steve, how has TABOR impacted the complexity of state and local governments?
Well, I've kind of referred to this several times in the process of answering other questions, so I'm not going to repeat myself, but it's really led to this mishmash of responses and, caused requirements of different referendums. It's really undermined representative government the way it was originally envisioned in our country, and certainly I think the way the Colorado Constitution was set up. So I could go on lots of things, but leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll do a tip of the hat to former Congressman David Skaggs, who mounted a charge in the court system to attack Tabor on the fact that it did diminish representative government. And they never got to the merits, the opposition to those claims, hung the thing up on standing. And I think that's where it quite frankly stands right now, is that trying to get into court, but he's been working that for many years, which would be a wonderful solution for federal court, state courts to say, sorry, your constitutional amendment's invalid because it violates the fundamental principles of doctrines of representative government. Kate, this question, again, going back to whether or not there's going to be a recession or not, is important in terms of how has Colorado's state fiscal policy addressed the business cycle? And in other words, have we saved enough money over time for a rainy day? Compared to some other states, that's also something we haven't done a particularly good job of. And we know that when we hit a recession that the state has to make a lot of cuts because there's no reserve.
Yeah, looking across the 50-year period, looking back to the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, we were experiencing a tremendous amount of population growth in Colorado. And even though we felt the pain of economic downturns, we had so much growth that it held tax revenue. Basically, we saw tax revenue continue to grow throughout those recessionary periods during that time. Move forward into the early 2000s, TABOR is in existence. We've got that TABOR limit. We can't keep anything excess above that TABOR limit. So when times are really good, it's harder to put that money away for a rainy day. Instead, you're refunding it to taxpayers. We have the early 2000 recession, and that's when things really started to get real, I think, in Colorado, because it was our first major downturn in revenue. It also coincided with a reduction in tax rates for both the sales and the income tax, coincidentally. And then, so didn't save enough for a rainy day, essentially then, and that resulted in a lot of major cuts to state government. Moving forward to the Great Recession, we saw something similar, where not enough saving for a rainy day. We don't have a rainy day fund here in Colorado. Instead, we have what's left over at the end of the fiscal year, the general fund reserve. And historically, it's been really quite low. After the Great Recession, there were efforts to grow it, and it has grown over time. We've got a larger and larger reserve. So our rainy day fund, if you can call it that, has gotten bigger. During the COVID recession, it's grown quite a bit, in large part because the state legislature was budgeting to a recessionary level of revenue. Revenue ended up coming in way stronger than expected. So you've got more revenue, less spending. And so right now we've got a really great reserve situation. So we're poised for a rainy day right now, probably for the first time in certainly recent history. I think the question is whether or not we can maintain that. Can we continue to save for a rainy day? And I hope the answer is yes. TABOR does make it difficult because of that, because of the limit, where in the good years, you're not able to save that for a rainy day. In the bad years, you're certainly incurring all of that downside risk, though.
Okay, great. I'm going to turn it to our fans, some questions. So this is sort of like who hits the buzzer first. We'll do it that way, okay? And then we'll finish up with the lightning round. And thank you again for the questions. What is a logical way for the state of Colorado to remove the budget stabilization factor in order to fund our education programs appropriately?
What's the first part of the question? What
is the logical way for the state to remove the budget stabilization factor in order to fund our education programs appropriately?
Can we force secession of certain counties in the state?
There you go. Yeah. I think I'll revert back to the pain. I'll revert back to the pain point I'll revert back to the pain point.
Right.
It's going to take grassroots. And that's the, that's the way it should be. We're a democracy. Sir. Yes, sir. We could do that. That's right. It costs money to do that as well. But the courts have been relatively friendly to workarounds, logical workarounds to conundrums in the TABOR movement. So for example, right after TABOR was adopted in 1992, Boulder County entered into a lease purchase agreement for a grader, one of those big yellow machines with one of those underneath grade roads, and took it to court through a test case to validate that the prior jurisprudence related to non-appropriation leases, certificates of participation, were still valid under TABOR, and the courts very quickly affirmed that the Supreme Court. On the other side of that equation, however, the Supreme Court, in connection with a transaction to build highways utilizing non-appropriation debt, was not as friendly. And they said you can't use a highway ultimately for your collateral, because who's going to rip up the highway and what can you do with the highway? And that's called the trans case. And so we've seen, kind of depending on the makeup of the Supreme Court here in Colorado, first they need to know something about public finance. They need to understand taxation. And none of those, I'm kind of evidence of that, none of those things are taught in law school. And it's taken me 40 years to figure it out, and I learn something new every day. And so the courts, it's a gamble when you go to the courts. So I think the answer to this question might be grassroots and pain points.
If I could chime in and throw out another option. So in my mind, looking over the course of time, the budget stabilization factor emerged not only because of TABOR, but because of its interactions with the Gallagher Amendment and Amendment 23. We've talked a little bit about Amendment 23 that requires a certain amount of funding for K-12. We talked a lot about TABOR, it caps how much money the state can retain and spend. It does a lot of other things too, but I'll leave it at that. And then the Gallagher Amendment, which recently had sort of a repeal, it basically ratcheted down the residential assessment rate. So when it comes to funding K-12, you've got a portion coming from the state, you've got a portion coming from local governments. So that Gallagher Amendment was limiting the portion from local governments. So the three are often referred to as the Gordian knots. They're all coming together and creating a lot of fiscal constraint when it comes to state and local government growth. And so I think the budget stabilization factor has really emerged because of that trifecta. With the Gallagher repeal, that does mean that there's more local share to fund K-12. And so if nobody touched anything when it came to property taxes, you might see that local share grow enough to be able to eliminate the budget stabilization factor. That said, ever since the repeal of Gallagher, we continue to see things either emerging, potentially being on the ballot, or legislative changes that are reducing that local share. I think that's something to watch. And so the logic, whether or not it's logical or not, I think there's this delicate interplay of, housing affordability, tax relief, and how much are we going to spend on K-12 education? It becomes kind of a political fight, whether or not it's logical.
Yeah, but the more you put K-12 education funded back to local government, the local property tax, the more inequitable it becomes, because the school districts that really need the help don't have any property tax. Cherry Creek's got plenty.
Yeah,
I mean, it's complex.
It is.
Yep. And thank you for mentioning Gallagher. That's a critical. It's a bar stool. It's got 3 legs. This whole issue. So thanks. Doesn't the majority of Colorado revenue come from marijuana sales tax? The news says millions of dollars in marijuana tax is added to the revenue. Is it fake news? I'm not going to comment on to whether it's fake news, but it's a great demonstration of those sales tax revenues are counting as part of the TABOR base.
Well, I can't speak to the state's budget and what percentage that the marijuana sales tax is, but I'll say for the city of Aurora, it's about 16 million out of $430 million. So it's really not a big revenue source. It's nice to have, and our city council really does appreciate it and has utilized it to fund the financing of 2 recreation facilities, some transportation projects that were cash funded, as well as addressing some of our homelessness and youth violence issues. So has it been beneficial to Aurora? Absolutely. Others might know about the state level and its utilization.
Sure. Yeah, similar at the state level where you've got about somewhere between a 35 and a $40 billion budget, at least general fund budget. Well, actually that's across streams. And then, so 30 to $40 billion relative to about 300 to $400 million in marijuana tax revenue. So it's meaningful. It sounds, when you say 300 to $400 million, that sounds like a really big number. And it is a big number, but relative to the budget as a whole, it's kind of a drop in the budget or drop in the bucket.
That's well said.
Yeah.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Let's see, Colorado is financially secure. Rebates are to be returned to the taxpayer. Do citizens have the right to say where state revenue is spent? And the answer is yes. Speak with your state senators and state representatives and call the governor. That's pretty simple, in my opinion. Panel?
Nothing to add.
Yep.
Okay.
No.
All right.
Kind of a bank shot, but yeah, that's true.
That's what they pay me the big bucks for, Steve. This is a great question. It seems that all of these are great questions. It seems that prior to the 1990s, municipalities and counties were flush with funds to support infrastructure. Since then, metro districts have proliferated, leading to infrastructure being funded by narrow neighborhoods or the districts. As the state grapples with affordable housing, what observations do you have for the funding of infrastructure to return to community-wide versus heavy burdens being carried by single neighborhoods and districts?
That's a big question.
I'd be happy to try to, I mean, I don't agree with the premise totally, because certainly prior to 1992, there were lots of water and sanitation districts in the beginning of metropolitan districts came before TABOR. And the whole idea of developers laying the costs of horizontal development for their new projects was a common practice. It is a common practice. The municipal utility districts in Texas versus the districts here. I mean, we used to call them tunnel bonds. There was a whole raft of water and sanitation districts in Vail and Eagle County and Aspen that as soon as the tunnel was finished, those bonds went way up in value because then they would have growth and they would be able to repay with their property tax. So is that a good way to put infrastructure in, or should you, in high growth areas, should you then lay it out on the tax or the homeowners that are going to be there for the next 30 years? Whatever. I mean, it's a complex question. I don't think it's just a TABOR question. You either pay it in the price of your house or you pay it as property taxes, which used to be more deductible than they are totally now. So again, more complexity.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll go after the premise as well. Prior to 1992, we saw the largest number of metropolitan district, special district defaults and bankruptcies,
Right.
which led to the state legislature creating a piece of legislation to regulate metropolitan districts and special districts when they issued securities, which was unheard of. It created regulation of a governmental entity's access to the capital market at the state law level, whereas Congress has never, and they've gone out of their way to not do that directly through what's called the Tower Amendment. And so the premise is a little shaky. And then it's
Yeah,
all.
but is it a local government when the developer owns all the land and does the vote because they passed,
Right.
with 3 owners of it? I mean,
For purposes of our state law, yeah. That's how Title 32 works.
Well, I guess I have a couple observations on metropolitan districts and the impacts to local government. I would say some of the good things are that you can actually get the development going and things happen fairly quickly. I would say the negative for local government is that now, taxes are higher in each individual district. So then where is the the will of the people to actually increase more property taxes on themselves for the greater good of the whole community. They're really looking at their neighborhood and what benefits them. So I think there's also equity issues as a result of metropolitan districts.
Sure,
So
sure. This is the last question, which I'm going to boil down to, is about unfunded mandates. So Congress can pass a law and tell the states that they have to provide a service or an activity and not fund it. Our General Assembly can do that as well vis-a-vis cities and counties. And the question is, how do we ensure that the state cannot mandate unfunded mandates? Again, my training working for a congressman was in grassroots politics. I worked on 2 congressional elections, and either the ballot box or calling your state representative, calling your senator, calling the governor would be one way to go after that. I would plead with folks not to put it in the Constitution. That's how here in Colorado, many of our populist views and ideas have been translated into constitutional provisions. I feel less strongly about a citizen initiative to make a statutory change, let's say, because the General Assembly always can change statutes. It's not possible with respect to some of these things being hardwired in our Constitution. That's my lawyerly view of it. Okay. Okay, quickly, we're going to move to the lightning round. If Colorado had not passed, if Tabor had not been passed, Colorado would be, and we'll do this, and then we'll do the panel first, and then you folks, is that okay? Or you want to hear yours first?
Let's listen to them.
What's that? You want to hear theirs first?
sure.
Okay. If Tabor had not been passed, Colorado would be less purple. Colorado would have tax burdens similar to California, Illinois, New York, and Massachusetts. Better off in terms of infrastructure and public services. Thank
Oh,
you.
we've got
Oh,
some
one more?
One more.
One,
Taking notes.
Oh,
okay. Would you like to read it? Would you like me to read it? I think I'm going to have you read it.
Oh, okay.
State that reaches full potential in investing in people through education and social and economic development, and land to reach all of their collective.
Okay, thank you. Can I go first for
Yes.
the panel? Okay. I'm going to steal, I asked this question of a prominent CU administrator last evening. And when I asked the question, I was expecting a longer answer, and I really loved this answer. It was very simple: better educated.
My answer really falls in line with some of what we've already heard, but I say thriving.
I don't know. I mean, how you can separate Tabor out and make one thing, but we've got so many currents in our society without social media, without the kinds of things that have happened in the polarization of our world today. Yeah, probably better, because I tend to be on the more progressive side than on the don't tax and be more. But, you know, I mean, it's like the national debt limit. We don't have a debt problem. We have a revenue problem. We don't collect enough taxes. People want all the services. They got to pay the taxes. So maybe we would have more services and we tax ourselves more. That's probably the answer.
Okay.
I'll go with a little bit of a safe answer, which is I think we'd have higher taxes and lower fees.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Great. All right. Great. Bert? Yeah.
She ought to be.
Yeah. This is the end of our session, and I always end sessions with two adages after 40 years in the bond business, and that is: one, buy bonds, very good investments for your retirement. And then second, there's 2 types of bonds: those that pay and those that don't. Very simple. Thank you, Terry, Steve, and Kate, for this morning. Your wisdom, your inspiration, your expertise. Hats off. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you as well.
And thank you for coming this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.